Hello, my name is Peter Hymans, and we're here in Los Angeles with Mr. Paul Schrade. And the purpose of this interview is to stream this to the JFK conference, which runs from the 16th through the 18th of November in Dallas, and have you enjoy the words of Mr. Paul Schrade, who was the labor chair for the campaign of Mr. Robert Kennedy. Thank you for consenting to this interview. We're all anxious to hear what you have to say, and we'd like basically to hear from you how you came to, a little bit about your personal history, your professional history, and then how you met Robert Kennedy, and take us on into the pantry at the hotel.
Anyway, Peter, welcome to our home, and
Thank you.
I'm glad to be able to do this. Unfortunately, I quit flying, so can't be at the conference, but this is one way to get the message to the conference.
Wonderful. So, how did you come to meet Robert Kennedy, and what was your relationship with him before the assassination?
The first meeting was at the 56th Democratic Convention in Chicago. We had set up a United Auto Workers Union room to greet other delegates. And as Walter Russo, the president of my union, president of UAW, and I approached the room, Bob and Jack Kennedy came out, and Jack Kennedy came over and says, "Walter, I would like your support for the vice presidency." And Walter said, "Young man, you've got to change your voting record." And everybody sort of laughed at that point. They went on. 1960, I was actually had been an officer of my local union, but had began working in Detroit as administrative assistant to Walter Russo, the president of the United Auto Workers Union. I went to Walter and said, "Look, Stevenson obviously is not making a really big push on this. I'd like to support Jack Kennedy like you are." And Walter said, "Fine." So he called Bob right there in front of me. Bob said, "Send Paul back to California. He was part of the Stevenson delegation. Tell him to bring over those delegates to Kennedy, to Jack Kennedy," which was my assignment at that point. Anyway, I went back to LA and worked very closely with Bob through 2 weeks ahead of the convention. Got to know him then, and found out a really very pleasant, good guy. He has this tough side, but on a personal level, he was always very wonderful, and we got to become friends. In the mid-afternoon, Bob Kennedy came back and said, "Walter," he said, "what's happening with the Michigan delegation?" He said, "You've got a really good leverage with them, because they're a lot of them from Detroit and other major cities, and what's going to be happening?" He said, "Well, they're off the floor, and they're discussing whether they're going to support Kennedy or not, because Governor Williams wanted to be the vice president candidate and had told Kennedy this during the afternoon." So I said to Bob, I said, "Look, here's Lyndon Johnson's statement where he's supporting every social justice, economic justice program of the platform, which is something new for him. We ought to get that to our guys, because two vice presidents were trying to coax the delegation over, because the convention had come to a standstill and the Michigan delegation was off the floor." And Bob says, "That's a great idea, Paul." And then he laughed. He says, "But none of us are delegates." So the guy with him reached into his pocket, pulled out a Texas delegate badge. Bob grabbed it, pinned it on me. He says, "Paul, go to the convention." So I went to the convention to try to get this Johnson statement into our guys in the Michigan delegation. Well, that's the kind of thing that Bob respected, because it was something that really helped getting that problem solved. And so we became very fast good friends with that. And we had a lot of fun during the convention. We spent time talking about it, working with other people, going to the bar, and it was just a good relationship we built at that point. It was great. Well, Dolores took us out on the picket line, and So we picketed the Giorgio grape vineyards. It was one of the biggest in California. And Bob walked the picket lines there. And the first time I'd ever been on a picket line with a guy like this. And so it was just a wonderful day. And Bob really captured the whole spirit of the farm worker struggle at that point, and led him to do things in Washington to be supportive.
So would it be fair to say that you could see that he really felt he was really being him and not just walking through the motions of being there?
Yeah, because he really was he had a very direct relationship immediately with Cesar Chavez and with Dolores. And they're lovable people and doing great work. And Bob was really a champion of social economic justice anyway, because he was working with native tribes in the United States. He'd gone to South Africa and worked with poor people there, challenging the administration. He went to the South, into Mississippi. And so he was really getting himself involved and committed to all the dealing with a lot of these individual problems that people were having.
So take us forward to Los Angeles. How did you find yourself being at the Ambassador Hotel, and walk through that process with us?
Well, it starts with the farm workers again. Bob Kennedy was the only politician invited to celebrate the end of Cesar Chavez's fast against violence. And he was really a very sick guy, and the only politician that he wanted there was Bob Kennedy. So Bob came out with some of his people to his rally of the farm workers, and 10,000 people at the park, and Bob was so well received there, so afterwards, I was on my way back to LA. I went back to the airport where we'd picked him up and to take him to the end of the fast. And I said, these people need the presidency more than anybody, and people like them. And I talked to him about this. Well, he didn't say no. He didn't push me off. He started asking me questions about what's happening in politics in California. He said, well, something's happening here. Well, that Friday, he announced in D.C., announced that he was running, and that was on a Friday. I went back to Detroit. I was on the national board of the UAW, representing the Western states, and so I flew overnight. Got in the parking lot as Walter Reuther, the president of my union, my mentor, was there, and I said, Walter, there's some things happening in California I'd like to talk to you about before I go back to LA. And he said, it's the first thing on the agenda, young man. So something happening here. So he took me on my, because I endorsed Robert Kennedy on Friday. When he announced, I endorsed attacking Johnson, the war, and because I was in the anti-war movement. Walter was not in the anti-war movement. And he used to call me in after board meetings and lecture me about how to do this. And I would lecture him back, saying, you've got to get involved. And he would say, well, you're not doing it in the right way. You got to do it. I said, that's why we need you there. But he was sticking with Johnson, and I was not. And that was the confrontation we were having at the board meeting. That night, I got a call from Jess Unruh, who was chairman of the Kennedy campaign in California, saying, what's happened with Cesar Chavez? Is he going on the delegation? Well, I said, well, Bob was supposed to call him today. What do you know about that? And he said, I don't know anything about that. So Jack Conway had Bob's home phone number. I called Bob at home, got him immediately. I said, what happened? He said, well, he sounded so sick and so weak. I didn't have the heart to ask him to go up against George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO, because they're now supporting the farm workers. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like a cold-blooded SOB you're supposed to be. And there was this little pause, and then he laughed. He says, yeah, Paul, but don't tell anybody. So he said, what do you think? I said, we absolutely need Cesar on the delegation. So he said, well, what can you do? I said, I'll call him. So I called him. And this was late at night in Detroit, but still early in LA and in California. So I was able to talk to Cesar. So all these things, there's all these things happen within an hour. And so I talked to Cesar. I said, Bob really needs you. Can you do something? He said, I'm going to call a meeting. So he called a meeting that night. I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. 100 ranch chairmen from the union had showed up, and they had unanimously instructed Cesar to go on the delegation. I said, yeah, George Meany's going to understand that kind of democracy. So that we had Cesar on the delegation, which was key to this because Latino vote in the farm areas as well as the big cities was really important to the Kennedy campaign, and it was. We found out.
So you weren't allowed to use your staff members?
Staff or any UAW money. But without my knowing it until much later, one of our staff guys who was doing our political work got a really large grant from Frank Mankiewicz of the campaign. So we had the money to get people out. Staff members on their own went out and campaigned. So I wasn't going to let Walter just deter me from all this kind of activity. It wasn't right as far as I was concerned, and it wasn't like him to do that. Election day, he comes to California. We go to Santa Monica to reopen negotiations on our collective bargaining agreement with McDonnell Douglas. We go up, we fly up north to meet with the vice president of the Teamsters Union, Einar Mohn, who's a really good guy and not fighting the farm workers. Anyway, we go up to have a meeting with him. On the way up, he says, how are you guys doing? How are you Kennedy guys doing on the board? Because we had a board of about nearly 30 people. I was one of the members. He said, well, about a third of them are for Kennedy and a third of them for Johnson. And a third are whatever you tell them to do. He kind of frowned at that. But he was still supporting Johnson at that point on election day. And which was really, but it's responsible for my big grin on the victory speech when Bob was making his victory speech. I was grinning widely because I knew that we had won, and that it would probably be okay now with Ruther, because he would be supporting Kennedy at that point.
That had to be a magnificent feeling, to be there on the stage and know that you had the momentum, standing there grinning. Can you describe the feeling at all?
Well, we had, I had gone up north with Ruther, flew back. I lived between the airport and the hotel. And I hate victory parties because there's a lot of drinking, noise, a lot of smoking at that point. So I was going home. And then I heard on the radio that Gene McCarthy was in the lead. I said, oh God, I better go down. So I went to the hotel. And one of Bob's people came up to me and said, Bob heard you got to the hotel. And he said, why don't you upstairs on the 5th floor? Which the 5th floor had been taken over by the family and the staff. And just everything was really happy at that point. Spirits had picked up because Bob was then leading. So we spent some time talking together about the campaign, and things like, Kenny O'Donnell, Jack Kennedy's chief of staff, now working for Bob, called in and said everything's okay with Chicago because what's his name? The mayor.
Mayor Daley?
Yeah. So Kenny O'Donnell calls and says everything is good with Mayor Daley because Mayor Daley was actually working for Johnson. I've got a lot of the phone calls off the LBJ library at that period. And so everything's okay. Then George McGovern called in saying he'd won in South Dakota. And he said, you also beat McCarthy here. And the Lakota tribe had voted like 69-2 for you and Gene McCarthy. So these are all big moments in at that point. So we finally decided to go downstairs, and Bob had, invited me to go in the room with him and Frank Mankiewicz and Fred Dutton of his campaign, and talk over the list of people to be recognized.